The Socialism Conference is the place in this country where we meet people who are involved in movement work, activist work on the ground in communities all across the country.
What I really love about Socialism Conference is that it's a space to be in community with other socialists, be in community with other people who are thinking about how do we actually build a movement for revolutionary and radical change in the world, and also just to have fun and hear about some of the work that each other is doing, to be inspired.
There is nothing that recreates the experience of being in Rome and being able to fellowship, being able to share ideas, being able to feel each other's presence in the physical form. It allows for a different level of connection. It allows for energetic vibrations that can't be captured via Zoom or via teleconference.
It's an opportunity for us to meet like-minded people. While we have a million differences, we're all in the struggle to make a better world, to make a world of balance and peace and justice and joy. And I find comrades here every time I come.
It's a place where we can dream about abolition and think about how we're going to create campaigns, how we're going to deconstruct the state while we're simultaneously creating the communities and care we need for all to survive and thrive.
If you are in any form of radical politics, movement building, art practice, facilitation, healing, restorative work, I don't know of another gathering that happens like this that puts those entities together. And it's not just an elitist conference. A lot of times you can go to a space like this and there's a lot of top line names and everyone else feels like an audience. But here this feels like a community co-learning and interacting with each other.
If you are a person that's trying to figure out how we can prioritize putting people over profit instead of profit over people, if you're a person that believes in racial justice and the social good, socialism might be a place where you could find your folks.
If you believe that we deserve a world where people are cared for, where people's needs are met, and where people can truly self-determine, socialism is a conference for you. This space will help connect you to those people for you to grow and build with for years to come.
I don't understand how we can ultimately dismantle any of it if we don't stick to a intensely radical politics.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
This event is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Now more than ever, it is critical to support independent publishers, independent bookstores, and independent voices. There are two ways you can do this today. First, by buying books from Haymarket at haymarketbooks.org. And secondly, by joining the Haymarket Book Club. The following event will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. If you like this event, be sure to catch these upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. You can register for these upcoming events on the Haymarket Books Eventbrite page. If you miss an event, you can listen to the recording afterward by subscribing to our podcast, Haymarket Live, wherever you get your podcasts. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we cannot guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate these guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. This event will have live closed captions. Instructions for accessing the captions will be posted in the chat. We should have time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. Thanks for joining us today. Our event will begin shortly.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to part 3, our last of the Call to Artists Through the Portal Learning Series. Before we start, I see some of y'all on YouTube, in YouTube land, and you should see a chat menu that you can hit and let us know where you're beaming in from, and also let us know what your creative practice or calling is. In the chat, it's great to see where y'all are coming from all over the country, all over the world. And while that's populating, I'm going to introduce myself and the series. So my name is Nati Linares. I go by she, her, mommy. I'm a mother, a communications and cultural organizer at art.coop. And I'm beaming to you live right now from Salt Lake City, Utah, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Goshute, Shoshone, Ute, and Paiute nations. I am so honored to co-create this virtual learning experiment with the good folks at the University of Illinois Chicago's Social Justice Initiative, Artists for Radical Imagination, Art.coop, and Haymarket Books. Special shout out to Bettina Johnson, Monica Trinidad, Roxana Espos, and Lola Ogbara, and the whole SJI team for helping make this happen. So today, again, this is the last part of our series, Call to Artists Through the Portal Learning Series. So for 3 Wednesdays in August, we've been connecting artists, designers, and content creators who aspire to contribute to movements for collective liberation, and connect them with grassroots organizers and educators working in the areas of economics, climate, and abolition. So each event is corresponding with soon-to-be-released booklets published in conjunction with the University of Illinois Chicago and Haymarket Books. And it's also in advance of the incredible gathering that's coming next month called Through the Portal, Growing the World We Want, which is happening from September 20th to the 22nd. You can get details about the conference at throughtheportal2024.com. So our goal with the series is to bring artists into dialogue with organizers, much like the Through the Portal conference we'll be doing later next month in person. So typically, as I'm sure a lot of you all know, as culture workers and artists, sometimes us as culture workers get brought in as decoration or entertainment at these sorts of gatherings. And rather than as key contributors and organizers themselves in our communities. And we at Art.coop and Artists for Radical Imagination felt that it was critical to bring artists in at the beginning to create spaces for dialogue, learning, and exchange. Like I saw recently, the incredible artist Ernesto Llerena, he put out a piece of work that said, artists are pollinators of culture and truth. We believe that artists engaged in grassroots organizing are absolutely necessary if our movements for justice are to advance. And we hope this series will lead to more and longer-term efforts that center artists who want to engage movements for systemic change, especially as empires crumble and the facade of denial is so acute. Shout out to many of you on the streets in Chicago, for example, who are exercising your right to protest during the DNC. This series is designed as an introductory space, so there may be a lot of unanswered questions, but we urge you to put your questions in the chat, which I see it's going, it's lit in there, and connect with us after this series. Lastly, I want to let you all know that there is a call to art connected with the conference Through the Portal, Growing the World We Want, where artists may submit work. We hope that this series the one on economics, the one on climate justice, and today's on abolition will spur inspiration around any kind of work that you want to create and submit for the conference. There's so much more to say, but I'll end there so we can get this conversation going. Our presenter today is Richie Reseda, a formerly incarcerated storyteller, music and film producer, content creator, and cultural organizer and creative director. Richie is the founder of the worker-owned media collective Question Culture, as well as a producer of the feature film Songs from the Hole, amongst many other incredible projects. Richie will lead us through an introduction to abolition movements and the ways in which arts and culture have intersected with movements for decarceration over the years and where we can go next. Then we'll have time for Q&A, so please use the chat on YouTube for your questions so we can get to them after this presentation. So thank you so much again for all of you for being here, and I'm going to kick it to Richie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Richie. My pronouns are he, him. I don't know if you could see me this whole time while I was biting my nails, but you didn't see that. I'll just thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for having me. This is like my favorite thing to talk about, be about, do in the world. So thank you, Nati. Thank you, Art Co-op and Haymarket. And thank you for the intro, Nati. I'm gonna introduce myself a little bit more. There's a couple things I want to add that I feel like could be relevant. And then we gonna get into it. I'm gonna try to keep what I share down to about 45 minutes. So that we could, then y'all can jump in the chat and we all could talk, because that's really where it's at. So I think the only thing I want to add to all the wonderful things that Nati shared that I really appreciate is that I am not an expert. And I don't mean that in a fake, humble way. I mean, abolition is truly an experiment. We're building a world that's never existed before. Yes, we lean on indigenous practices and understandings, but leaning on indigenous practices and understandings in a world with the internet that's never happened before, right? We're in a new moment. So everything is an experiment. Adrienne Marie Brown says we're all babies when it comes to our practice. So I'm truly standing on the shoulders of everybody who's been trying things, and we've been able to pull lessons from what they're trying this whole time. I am someone who has survived very violent punishment culture, including the 7 years I was incarcerated in prison, the small stints I was locked up, as a child, and getting kicked out of classrooms and schools and eventually society. And I put a lot of effort into understanding punishment culture and practicing something different. And the more I learned, the more I saw it, how it's connected to everything, and how it really requires me to transform the way that I live my life. And we all have experienced punishment culture and colonial culture. And hopefully today we'll be able to, even like leaving here, we'll be able to see even more of it and transform more of it in our lives and practice. My greatest hope today is that we leave here with things we can do. This isn't about knowing stuff. Abolition is not about knowing shit and debating people and being smarter than people. It is truly about something that we do. We've gotten really good at talking about it, and we're really new to being about it. There's a big difference between understanding how a bike works and actually being able to ride one with your body. So that's what I'm going to be inviting us to do today, is build actual practices that we can immediately apply in our lives the moment this ends. With that being said, that does require a degree of vulnerability. So I just kind of want to give that invitation, like, to enter into this conversation is to enter into vulnerability. I'm very vulnerable. My goal is to be very vulnerable with how I share. To me, it's the only way to talk about real shit and be about real shit. And I invite y'all to do the same. And if you're not ready for that, lovingly, no ultimatum energy, you could bounce. Like, it's okay. You might not be ready for this, what we're about to do here today, and that's okay. Especially since you're just streaming it. I won't take it personal. You could click out. I can't even see y'all, so do what you need to do. With that, I'm now going to I'm gonna put up some visuals for my visual learners out there. John, if we can start with the first slide. Cool. So let's actually now go to slide 2. So what is abolition? Abolition is abolishing the colonial system and its culture with a focus on punishment culture and its most extreme form, incarceration and physical punishment. Abolition is abolishing the colonial system and its culture. So when we're talking about abolition, this is what I mean. This is what the people who I practice with mean. I'm not here to say that my definitions are the definitions. I'm just here to give you all the definitions that I got, or that are helpful for me to use. You know, all words are made up, but if we can agree to using it this way, we can at least be talking about the same thing. So when me and my people talk about abolition, we're talking about abolishing the entire colonial system and its culture with a focus on punishment culture and its most extreme form, incarceration and physical punishment. So where does it come from? I'm gonna run through like a quick kind of history of abolition. And John, this is when we gonna have to be like in step. If we could go to slide 3. So cool. So I'm gonna start with the Roman Empire, and y'all seen the memes about the Roman Empire. So when the Roman Empire kind of took over more or less all of Europe, a lot of the Middle East, Western Asia, and North Africa. So it was huge, and over the course of time, it split into 2, and then it fell apart. And that's where we're gonna start this story. When the major city-state of the Roman Empire fell apart, the system of feudalism began in Europe. And feudalism is like, if you've ever seen a Disney movie, anything with kings, queens. Y'all can hear me over these planes, right? Okay, cool. Anything with kings and queens and knights, and that's feudalism. And the way that feudalism worked was, because the Roman Empire fell, what happened was a bunch of small kingdoms or fiefdoms arrived, which was a system where you had people who owned the land, which were the aristocracy, people who worked the land, which were the peasants, and the kings. So the monarchs that then ran swatches of land at the same time and waged war on behalf of multiple aristocrats who owned land. And just some key things to note was this was an economy based on land. So in order to get more rich, you needed to get more land, which is why aristocrats had peasants who worked their land and had kings who went and waged war for them to get more land. It was the only way to become more rich, was to become more land. You can only grow so much on the land. So it put Europe in a state of always being at war with itself. You know, England fighting France, France fighting England, France fighting Germany, like always taking each other's land, taking each other's peasants, treating them like property. And this was all, again, through the end of the Roman Empire, going into the Christianizing of Europe. And with the Christianizing of Europe, you know, the idea started to become, it's not right to steal each other's land, to rape people, to steal and to rape and to pillage. And therefore something needed to shift. But remember, the economy itself was based on the ownership of land. So therefore, where were they going to get the land from? Next slide. Slide 4. So the Portuguese, who were trading in Western Africa at the time, had the idea of, well, we can't steal from each other and still be quote unquote good Christians. So what if we stole from these other people? And they kidnapped a Black person, put them in a cage, and brought them to the Pope, and said, "My Lord, what do we do with him?" And Pope Nicholas V responded, and I quote, "We grant you," the Pope spoke of themselves as we, because they were saying we as in them and God, "grant you full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. To invade, search out, capture, vanquish, subdue all Saracens and all other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, in the kingdoms, dukedoms." Okay, so y'all get it. They basically said, go colonize and enslave everybody who are not European Christians. And I would assert that this was the beginning of racism as we understand it. This was the beginning of the idea that you had one group of people who we now call white people, who were European Christian people. And then you had everybody else, and the idea that only European Christians were humans and everybody else was some subservient version of human or non-human to justify stealing from them, stealing our labor, stealing our land, because the European economy required this. Slide 5. So this began the transatlantic slave trade with 1525 and 1866, the entire history of the slave trade in the quote-unquote New World. 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the Americas, and about 10 million people survived. It's hard to overstate the way that slavery changed the world. It was a 300, honestly, the first case, the first criminal case for somebody committing slavery was in 1940. So a 400-year-old period that really shaped almost every institution that we have today. A great resource for folks to look up that I would say is a Mando resource is the 1619 Project. If you just listen to the podcast alone, it explains how slavery shaped our current medical system, how slavery shaped the stock market was invented during slavery, and our entire way of doing business with like boards and then executives and managers and workers and natural resources, and all of that being owned by somebody. All of this was shaped during slavery and colonization. I'm telling y'all all this because people think abolition is just about getting rid of prisons, which is actually it's just so much bigger than that. But that'll become clear as we go forward. So in 1865, the end of the Civil War, slavery is reformed. It wasn't abolished, it was reformed to say that you cannot enslave somebody except for as punishment for a crime. And that was a key, except for as punishment for a crime, was a key thing that was put in there so that the southern states would sign off on it, and the war could end. And so then slavery as it existed before that split into three systems: the peonage system, where you could be enslaved if you were in debt; sharecropping, where you could be enslaved by, a simple way to say it is like, you don't own this land, but you work this land and you're allowed to live here, but you're not a slave, but essentially you were enslaved. And this is actually the legacy my family comes from, is sharecropping. And then convict leasing, where one could get incarcerated and then their labor could be leased out to governments, private companies, and even private individuals. And it is at this time where, like, Angola State Prison in Louisiana was born, because the day before it was the Angola family plantation. And through convict leasing, much of the infrastructure of the city of Atlanta was built with enslaved leased labor. Infrastructure in the city of DC was built with enslaved leased labor. A lot of private companies were leasing enslaved labor. Prior to this, there were virtually no Black people in prison. Prisons were not even a major institution. Prisons actually were initially a religious institution, penitentiary, penitence. The idea that if somebody was understood to be causing harm, that they just needed to be in isolation with God. This was a Catholic institution, and you would be locked in a room with a Bible. And it was practiced all different types of ways. Sometimes you could self-admit and tell them when you want to leave. Sometimes you couldn't, whatever. So that's a much older institution that was actually a religious one, and was not widely practiced as a government institution until the reformation of slavery. Then it became a state system. And it wasn't until the early 1900s where the police were invented to take people to prison. And these prisons were filling up with Black people through a bunch of laws called the Black Codes in the American South, which made things illegal, like loitering was a black code, which was just being outside. You got to think you were just enslaved yesterday, today you're not, but you're not allowed to be outside. Or there was black codes like if you steal something, for every dollar it was is a year that you would spend in prison. So prisons went from being a really small, not very common institution with almost all white people in them because black people were property and couldn't be incarcerated. We weren't considered people legally, to becoming something that was almost filled with black people. And then there were lawsuits and social movements to end the black codes, which resulted in the separate but equal doctrine, which created segregation, or the idea of two societies, one for black people, one for white people, but both are quote unquote equal. And as we know, that existed for about 100 years and was challenged by the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I know I'm covering a lot. Rock with me. Civil rights movement in the 1960s, at its heart, had a very people call everything civil rights. They call Malcolm X civil rights. They call the Black Panther civil rights. That's not civil rights. That's actually the Black Power movement. The civil rights movement was a very specific movement. And the idea was to actually practice nonviolence. And if the world's, to show the world how brutal this system is, so that you win over the hearts and minds of people, so that they'll stop believing in it, and also to just put your body in the way so that the system doesn't work, which was civil disobedience, which is a major tactic of the civil rights movement. Another way of understanding civil disobedience is called breaking the law. If you go sit at a lunch counter in which you're legally not allowed to sit, that is technically breaking the law, and that's where law and order comes in. Slide 7. So if you don't know who this person is, his name is Barry Goldwater. He was a state senator from Arizona, I want to say, and he was kind of the inventor of the law and order politician. He was like, he knew he could win votes. He knew that the white voters were uncomfortable with the civil rights movement, and if he could frame civil rights organizers and activists as lawbreakers who white voters needed protection from, then he could win elections. And this was an extremely effective strategy. He wrote a book called The Conscience of a Conservative that is still in the canon of conservative literature to this day. So he ended up winning, going from a state senator to a national senator, and then ran for president and lost. But his successor, Richard Nixon, ran on the law and order ticket and won, started the war on drugs when there was no drug problem at the time. And then we get this guy, slide 8, Ronald Reagan, who was probably the most effective law and order president of all time. He continued to run on the law and order ticket, and actually went on to bring crack cocaine into Black communities, to come back and revamp the drug war, which was dying out at that point. And he had to get crack popping, which is all it's now been long enough that all of these documents are redacted. It sounds like some conspiracy theory type shit, but unfortunately it's very true. That crack was brought into, and it wasn't even called that. It was just called rock cocaine. He allowed it was even connected to the war in Nicaragua, but we only got so much time. But long story boring, rock cocaine was brought into disenfranchised Black and brown communities. He invested a bunch of money into PR for the news to start calling it crack and sensationalizing the idea of crack and crack babies and crack moms and crack gangs and crack wars and a crack down. And that effort of the war. Then he went to Congress in 1983 and got a bunch of money for the drug war, and that boomed our prison population from being about 175,000 people when he started, and to over 2 million people by the time I got locked up in the early 2010s. So I tell you this whole story because to be able to really understand what abolition is, abolition came about of the people fighting to abolish slavery. But slavery was connected to all these other things. Slavery is connected to land, and it's connected to this idea. And by the time we get here, it's connected to this idea of deservance. Back in the day, from the 1452, Pope Nicholas justified colonization and slavery by saying they deserve it because they do not believe, quote unquote, believe in God. And by the time we get to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is saying they deserve it because they broke the law. And I really want us to look at this idea of deservance because ultimately we're artists and we're here to talk about culture. And the idea of deservance is what is at the heart of punishment culture. It's used to justify slavery and colonization. It's used to justify violence to this day. It's the reason why when we talk about Palestine, people love to say, well, what about Hamas? Do you condemn Hamas? The people of Gaza voted in.
Yeah.
So that's what we're. Okay, but I'm back now. Okay, cool. So what I was saying about that was people bring up Hamas to say that, the people of Gaza voted in Hamas in 2006, and therefore they deserve this genocide that is happening in Gaza. And to abolish abolition, to abolish the prison system, to abolish slavery, to abolish colonialism, we need to abolish the idea of ranking people based on what we think they deserve. So if we're getting rid of that, which is already huge, right? You might be watching that and being like, what the fuck? That kind of governs everything I think about everything. So what do we do? What are we building? So let's go to slide 9. So if we're abolishing the idea of deservance, here are some key terms and skills that we can institute that replaces that. It gives us another way of being and understanding. And this is what I mean when I say this is all applicable shit that we can do immediately right now. First thing I want to look at is understanding versus judgment. I would assert that, and again, this isn't the be all end all definition of these words. This is just a way of understanding shit so we can be on the same page. I would assert that understanding and judgment exist on a spectrum, on opposite ends of the spectrum. That understanding is the opposite of judgment. Understanding is seeking how we are the same. Judgment is seeking how we're different. Understanding asks questions like, what conditions would lead me to ask like that? Judgment asks questions like, what's wrong with that person? Understanding humanizes, judgment objectifies. Understanding invites connection, judgment invites domination. So we can see somebody doing something that we experience as harmful and choose to understand it. That doesn't mean justify it, quote unquote. Justification is a made up thing. It's imaginary. It doesn't exist. Like you can't touch it, right? There's no such thing as excuses. It's all fake. Or I should say it's all cultural. Understanding doesn't make it okay that somebody harmed us. It just leads us to see what led to that harm. In what conditions would I harm somebody like that? It humanizes the person. As abolitionists, to be an abolitionist is to be committed to always seeing a person in their story. The story exists whether we recognize it or not. Our current culture, deservance culture, punishment culture, teaches us that there's a certain point in which we don't have to consider somebody's story. Abolition is like, we always have to consider your story because ultimately to resolve a problem, we need to know where it came from. So that's where understanding leads us. Seeking how we're the same, what conditions would lead someone to act like that? It humanizes and invites connection. Let's go to slide 10. Here's some skills on how to do that. Number 1, listening. Listening is the most important skill that I've learned in the last 2 years. I could truly say I did not know how to listen until 2023, when I was being called in by my best friend and core like transformative justice practice partner, who's kind of seen me through my whole arc of when we met in high school, started organizing, me going to prison, organizing in prison, coming home, and really was able to witness a lot of the harm that I've caused, and like call me into a deeper form of accountability. And I was so defensive because I was still living within that like deservance thing, and I was just trying to be a good person. You know, I came from years of being told I was a bad person, from teachers to cops to going to prison, and I really had to learn these listening skills in order to hear what they were saying, to actually transform the things that I was doing that was harming people, whether intentionally or not. So in deservance culture, punishment culture, we're taught to listen to be right, listen to respond, or listen to quote unquote be objective. I would assert all three of those things invites domination, because again, if I'm right, I don't have to listen to you. I get to dominate you, smush you, you matter less. Or I'm just trying to respond to you, dominate you, smush you, you matter less. Or what's objective? Let me use my subjective brain with my 6 senses to see the objective truth. And therefore, I can decide if I get to dominate you, subjugate you, smush you, right? Not have to listen to you, not have to consider you, not have to consider your story. Pretend that your story doesn't impact mine because it's not related to the objective, whatever. So transformative listening is listening to understand, which is I'm listening to you to understand your perspective. It's like watching the movie from that person's camera. When you're watching a movie from someone's perspective, you don't interrupt the movie every time they have a perspective. You don't. You're here to see their perspective. You're here for the ride. After listening to understand is listening to believe. Not only am I here to understand your perspective, I'm here to believe that that is your perspective. That doesn't mean everything you say is going to line up with my perspective. It doesn't mean you're not actually going to straight up lie, like on purpose. You might, but I can believe you that you feel like you need to do that to meet your human needs. And then finally, listening to transform. So now that I understand you, now that I believe that you were just trying to meet your human needs, even if it's in ways that I experience as harmful, now I can transform myself in a way to account for your story and what you're going through. And that transformation might look like boundaries. It might look like, okay, this is where you're at. I see that's where you're at in your story, and I got to be over here. So another skill is multi-partiality, which is seeking and valuing everyone's side of the story. Like, it's the idea that I don't know all of the relevant truth until I know all the perspectives of that truth from everybody involved. And then the next one is integration, realigning our needs and building consensus. Integrity is kind of taught to us as doing what you say you're going to do. I'm inviting us to consider a deeper version of integrity. It comes from Bell Hooks' definition of integrity, and we've kind of built on it from that through practicing together in the community, the TJ practice community I'm a part of, which is the Abolition Dream Lab, which is, let me say a thing about needs, because I think I actually forgot to put that slide. If we can agree that all humans have the same needs to be safe, be healthy, and be fulfilled, connected, in community. If we all have those needs, then integrity is living in a way where I'm meeting my needs in a way that also meets the needs of my immediate community, in a way that also meets the needs of all natural things. That is true integrity, like my self-integrity, my community integrity, and my global integrity, or my universal integrity. And integration is the act of realigning our needs and building consensus, like integrating with each other. I know I'm covering a lot. I'm very excited for this Q&A. Embodiment is doing all these things in real life, not just thinking about them. And I would say all these things start with understanding instead of judging. The last term that I kind of want to go through is accountability. Because if we're seeking, we're not taught to align our needs with others. we're taught that our needs are all at odds. That in order for me to eat, you need to not eat, right? It's the way that our businesses are even set up. One business has to get more customers so the other one gets less, right? It's the way that we understand our needs in our relationships. I can't listen to your story because then my story gets shrunk somehow. So the practice of aligning our needs, of living in integrity in a way where my needs I'm meeting my needs in a way that supports our needs, in a way that supports the universe's needs, is a very new practice in a lot of ways. Our bodies are good at it. I'm made up of trillions of cells. Each one of them is suiting its own needs in a way that suits its bodily system's needs in a way that suits my needs. But then oftentimes I don't treat my body well, right? I might not give it the rest it needs, the water it needs. Like, this is the first forest that I exploit. So because I was raised in capitalism, I was raised in competition, I was raised in domination, I was raised in colonialism, I don't have necessarily those skills of living in integrity, even with my own body. So it takes practice. So accountability, which is largely used in this culture to mean like punishment. People be like, you need to be held accountable. And what they mean is like, you need to burn. What they mean is you need to burn. You need to be hurt. People say, they think that our quote unquote justice system holds people accountable. It doesn't. There's no accountability required, only punishment and violence. I find it helpful to use this definition of accountability, which is when we support one another to live in the integrity that we're talking about. Accountability is supporting one another to live in integrity with consent and without shame. So it's accounting for what happened and what needs to change instead of what went wrong and who needs to be punished. It assumes that we're all trying to live in integrity with self, with each other, with the earth, that we consent to that. We're down to do it without shame. And therefore, when we naturally don't do that, or feel like we don't do that, or someone else feels like we don't do that, we account for what happened. What is all that happened? What happened systemically? What happened societally? What happened culturally? What happened with my own choices? And what needs to change so that I can live in that integrity, as opposed to what went wrong and who needs to be punished. So now getting to the art part. We cannot spread what we do not practice. So if we're seeking to spread everything that I just talked about in our art, but we're still just flowing with the natural culture of capitalist, colonialist, domination-based culture, that's what we're going to be spreading, is capitalist, colonialist, domination-based culture. So in order to, it is my belief, it is my experience as somebody who's been practicing and at this abolitionist art making since I was 14 years old, that in order to make abolitionist art, we have to have an abolitionist art practice, and an abolitionist human practice. So I'm going to give some examples of how we do it at the artist collective that I'm a part of, Question Culture. Let's go to slide 12. We were just on 11, right? Great. I was like, did I forget to say that? So slide 12. So we know that this is the current culture, right? Capitalism, where you have owners who hire managers to move around an economic engine, which includes workers, natural resources, money, and time, in order to get money and power for the owners. And the type of power is because I said so power, because I got the bag, because I started the company, because I have the laws on my side and I have access to the violence of the police, whatever. And the economic engine is only built to suit the needs of the owners. That's the general culture. If we're not going against this, we're flowing with it, which is hard because a lot of us are freelancers. We get hired by corporations to make art for them, and they're definitely running on this model. Let's go to slide 13. So here's a model of how we've practiced abolition, cooperation, whatever you want to call it, in Question Culture. We've aligned our owners, our workers, and our managers so that we all share power, and it's because we agreed so power. And we also move around natural resources, time, money, ourselves, since we are the workers and the owners and the managers, to make money for the collective, but we also do it in a way that puts money back. The economic engine is suited to build the needs of everyone it affects. And let me give you some examples of what I mean. When we do a production, part of our business model is doing production. We've done podcasts, we've done films, we've done live events, whatever. We're not seeking to pay people as little as possible and squeeze as much work out of them on set as possible so we can keep as much money. We actually want to pay people as much as we can afford to pay them and still have our set profit margin that keeps us alive as a cooperative. So for example, when we did Abolition X, our podcast with Spotify, we made it a part of our literally initial negotiation and in our contract that all of our incarcerated guests, which we had an incarcerated guest on each show, got paid $500 for coming on and sharing their story and experience. That's money we could have just kept for us, and incarcerated people would have been happy to be on the show and just be heard, because while we're incarcerated, we're silenced. But the point of the show was to actually empower incarcerated people. And we did something similar when we did our film, Songs from the Hole. We hired actual formerly incarcerated people to play the incarcerated people, and we paid them the most we can afford to pay them, not the least. Another way we do it is like giving people unlimited time off, things like that, investing back into our people, back into time, back into natural resources. Let's go to slide 15, actually. Let's skip 14. So how do we do it on the ownership side? Well, right now we have which we call them founders here. I don't even know if that feels like the most helpful language, but the initial 5 members of the collective own 30% of the profits made by the collective. And the rest is split by half by all the artists who are currently signed and all the employees while they're signed. And it's only those initial members who collect for life, because we put in something that will give for life. It's not a money grab. It's, we started something that will live on, as opposed to somebody who's able to like come in and then bounce. And it is my intention that 30% that goes to the original members will shrink over time, because as more artists come in, as more employees come in, as more people put resources, their time and money and energy into the pot, that initial investment will just become smaller and smaller of the total of what has been invested. And people, if you're in multiple of these, like I'm in all 3 of these groups for Question Culture, I will collect from all 3 of these. Now, I gotta say, this is all theoretical at this point because we haven't been profitable, but that's what it is to be, actually, I'm not even gonna say that's what it is. That's what it's been so far. Let's go to slide 16. And then I want to talk about power and how we make decisions. Everything we were just talking about with the culture of cooperation versus domination, the culture of true accountability, of listening to understand, to believe, to transform, it also translates into how we make our decisions as an art collective. So in order to truly make decisions together, it requires deep democracy, which, like, true consent is like making an informed, full-bodied choice. Not, it's okay, I'll go with it, but like, I really understand what this is and I am fully saying yes to it. In order to do that, follow me with just the darker writing. We need a shared vision. In order to have a shared vision, we need shared skills. Like, if you don't have the skills to even recognize when you're triggered, or recognize when you're defending something that we don't even know what you're defending, some personal ego thing for you, then we actually can't move in this transformative way. And then to have shared skills, we need to have shared values. If you don't value mental health, if you don't value transparency and honesty, or value anti-capitalism, like, this isn't going to work. So because we need these things, the lighter writing is what Question Culture offers us to do it. And this part is shifting. Actually, it was monthly transformative justice family conversations, where we do the relational work and the political education. And then we had monthly leadership meetings where we make the choices. And then we have, for our shared vision, we have weekly and yearly visioning sessions to stay on the same page. For our shared skills, we have those monthly TJ conversations. And for our shared values, we have those monthly TJ conversations. And this might be shifting now as we're like leaning into what the team really wants. Because as we tried to practice this, we kept running up into stuff like having formerly incarcerated people on the team who were saying like circles felt like the type shit we had to do in prison. And like, so we were running into like ways this wasn't working. So now we're adjusting. And that's what I mean when I say abolition is truly an experiment, where we're like, learn and try something new, learn and try something new. So that's the way that we've been trying to practice it as a collective in Question Culture. Now I want to talk about the art itself. We don't all have our own artist collective. Some of us work on our own. Some of us, work for colonial style corporations, what have you, right? So let's talk about the art itself. How do we make art that it is in itself is abolitionist? Let's go to slide 17. So there's 3 levels of culture. At the bottom level, like the closest, the deepest level, the root, is number 1, the patterns that arise as people collectively meet their needs. So anywhere where you have more than one person meeting their needs in the same space, they're going to develop a culture. They're going to develop a language. They're going to develop inside jokes. They're going to develop a way of doing things. Because again, we all have those same 3 needs: to be healthy, to be safe, to be connected. And we're going to meet those needs. And we're going to meet those needs based on the conditions around us. If you're from a place with a lot of mangoes, there's going to be all different kinds of mango-based foods. You know, if you're from a place with a lot of water, you're probably going to have a culture based around fishing, right? So that is culture at its most base level. It's the patterns that arise as people collectively meet their needs. The next level of culture is people doing the thing because it's cool. So for example, like I have my dead homies and my past and my late father and I have Nipsey Hussle and tatted on my body, right? That's a pattern that arose in LA culture where I'm from as people were mourning their dead. Black and brown people who come from like a similar street culture and street tribes like I do, we get our ancestors tatted on us as a way of grieving, as meeting a human need. And then that's at level 1. At level 2, we also do it because now it's become a quote unquote thing. So now we do it to be cool in a way. It's like, and cool, to be cool is not a bad thing. Cool just means like accepted and in step with the culture. So it's like, yeah, I'm from LA. I'm going to do it this way. There's a lot of ways to grieve. I could look up on the internet and bite someone else's culture or whatever, but this is how we do it here. So I'm also doing it to feel a part of, to be cool. And then the farthest level of culture, the most distant, the most disconnected, is when culture is being sold for some kind of profit or capital. And because profit isn't the only kind of capital, you also have social capital on the internet. Now if I make a video about getting your homies tatted and I'm doing it because I want views and clout, that's level 3. That's like I'm now selling the culture for something. And I'm not saying any of this is bad. I'm just saying it is what it is. For me, it's helpful to take shit out of good and bad because that's part of deservance culture. But this is just helpful for us to know as artists who are trying to make art for abolition. So, like I was saying earlier, we can only spread what we practice. Let's go to 18. In my opinion, art is simply a portal. It's very important. Portals are very important, but it's not the whole thing. Art cannot achieve abolition in and of itself because abolition is a culture shift, and culture happens at that first level of like the way we meet our needs has to shift. Art can introduce us to a new way of meeting our needs, but it doesn't change the way what we do every day. Like at some point, that's where we get into cultural organizing. Like the art can show us a new way of being, and then cultural organizers actually work to help us live in that new way of being. So I'll use an example. Our film at Question Culture that we did in collaboration with Coco Motion Pictures, Songs from the Hole, which is now in the film festival circuit. Songs from the Hole is a documentary visual album that follows the story of my friend and QC artist JJ88 as somebody who both survived and committed very serious harm. It follows him and his family's healing journey through music and documentary. And part of that journey included building an accountability community that was not based in shame. People who supported 88 and being the version of himself that he wanted to be, even against the odds of having a life sentence in prison that he was given at 15 years old. This movie is a fucking portal. People watch it, it brings up a lot for them. It brings up a lot of emotions for them. It reminds them of the trauma they're holding in their own lives, the violence that they've witnessed or participated in or survived in their own lives. And that's really important. From there, we then started doing our impact campaign where we show the film in places like Racine Youth Prison here in Wisconsin. And then we get into circles and we talk about how do we now take these tools of non-shame-based accountability, of integrity-based accountability, and actually build accountability communities, or what Mia Mingus calls pods, in real life. And this is like, we as a team are still really even grappling with how to do this. We've done it about 5 times in different impacted communities around the country, but it requires us to do it. Like, we cannot spread an accountability community practice or a pod practice without having one ourselves, right? And we were all raised in colonial culture, so we have to build it first. So it's been kind of like, see, the art is transforming us and we are transforming the art, and we're using the art to transform the community. That, I would assert, is abolitionist art at its deepest level. Now, some artists are just gonna make the portal. They're gonna be like, yo, my life's work was to make this portal, and now y'all got to take it and run with it. And that's okay. I'm not here to say anything is good or bad. I'm just talking about the depth of how abolitionist some shit can be. I'm not saying that's not abolitionist. I'm saying it's introducing someone to an abolitionist step 1 is a step 1. I'm most interested in going all the way at this point with multiple genocides, multiple members of my family being incarcerated. It hurts too much to just do the step 1 for me. So this kind of leaves us at like, what's next? What's next for question culture? What's next for, which is where my creative practice lives. What's next for the Abolition Dream Lab, which is where my cultural organizing practice lives. And these 2 projects are very, very related. They're kind of one experiment in my mind. It is helping the world build this kind of circular accountability, build these accountability communities, or what Mia Mingus calls pods, where we sit in circle to be held to hold each other accountable in living in that type of integrity. Again, when I say integrity, I mean living in integrity with our own needs, the needs of our immediate communities, and the needs of all natural things. This type of accountability practice, like when most people are like, well, if we abolish prisons, like, what do we do instead? We do this. Like, we do pods. We practice circular accountability. In the center of your circular accountability, it is your spirituality, your mental health, and your own integrity. Because if you don't care about your own integrity, we don't have nothing to hold you in integrity to with. And if I'm dysregulated, if I'm unhealthy, if I'm triggered every other second, if I'm not healing my trauma from my incarceration, or healing my patriarchy from being, socially conditioned as a quote unquote man or whatever, like, I can only be held accountable to the work that I'm willing to do, right? So that's what's at the center of the work. That's the root. And then I have my accountability community that's supporting me in living in this integrity, because I'm asking them to, because I want it, because I know it's what's best for me and my community and all living things on earth. And I know if we were to do this, then if everybody was doing that, if everybody was in a pod, if everybody was being held accountable by their loved ones to live in integrity with themselves, the community, and the earth, we wouldn't have no genocide. We wouldn't have no incarceration. We wouldn't have war. We wouldn't have rape culture. And I mean this in a very real way. Like, the Generation 5 produced a report that I'm rereading. I read it when it came out in 2017 when I was in prison, called How to Get Rid of Child Sexual Abuse in 5 Generations. Child sexual abuse happens in isolation. It happens in a vacuum. If everybody has the space to share without shame what they're going through with their closest loved ones and be held accountable for being in integrity, child sexual abuse doesn't happen. I committed robbery in 2011 and went to prison. If I was sharing without shame with my people what I was going through and being held to being in my integrity, and accountability and support go hand in hand. Being supported, I wouldn't have committed those robberies. That harm wouldn't have happened. Those people wouldn't have been traumatized, those people who I robbed, right? I had a friend who was murdered last year by somebody in a mental health crisis. If that person was being held accountable by their closest loved ones to live in integrity and supported, that wouldn't have happened, right? My father passed in 2020. Like, he lived for his family. He worked his ass off for his family. He never went to the doctor. He didn't check up on his health. Again, if his friends were holding him accountable, in like a structured, on purpose way, not just like every once in a while, because if we're doing it every once in a while, whenever we feel like it, our ego can also choose to not do it when it's uncomfortable and we don't want to be held accountable for something we actually need. But if they were holding him accountable, taking care of himself so he could be around, he wouldn't have passed in his early 50s maybe. So like, this is truly, when we're getting rid of the deservance-based punishment culture, violent model of people being able to access their needs, and going to a circular regenerative model of people being able to access their needs. Practice pods are everything. Accountability pods are everything. And it is my belief, it is my practice, it is my experience doing this now for 18 years, that the most abolitionist art and cultural organizing will lead us into practice pods. And that requires us to practice it first before we can even spread it in our art. And with that, I will end the presentation right on time.
Wow. Thank you, Richie. Richie took us on a journey. I was just living for the, getting to the root and the historic kind of like history lesson that I think is so important. So I just want to remind everyone in the chat, so please let us know your questions. We've got some really good ones lined up, and it's a heavy topic, and I just really want to thank you, Richie, for your vulnerability and your practice and sharing with us how you all struggle together to, create these worlds. It's not easy. So we have a question from the chat. Really good. Abolition feels like a practice that requires deep intention, trust, and patience. What are some of the ways you invite folks into that process? You spoke a little bit about that of, coolness and popular culture and how you bring people in, but do you have some stories around how you in your world, in your city, invite folks into that kind of deep practice that you went over today?
Yeah, thank you. And do we have any slides up, or now is it just my face? Just so I know. Okay, it's me and nothing. Okay. And we showed the last slide, right? I didn't skip saying that. Okay, great. Period. Thank you. So it's twofold. One, again, it has to start with my own personal practice. So it doesn't start with the people farthest away who are the most addicted to capitalism and deservance and punishment and genocide. Like, it doesn't start with how do we get Donald Trump to like live in integrity. Like, it doesn't start with the cops. It doesn't start with the legislature. People who do policy work, that's very important. I'm not knocking that at all. That's how I got free. But I'm saying this is not that. This is starting with my closest loved ones, inviting people in. That's like, to be close to me is to practice this with me. I don't have closeness that's outside of this. Because what I've learned is, when I was practicing closeness with people who did not require this of them, they inevitably ran into serious harm. And now that I'm close to you, I'm like part of the cleanup crew. But I had no access to hold you accountability and to account on the front end to stop that from happening. And as somebody who just comes from traumatized communities, it's just too many fires to put out. It was burning me out. It was killing me. So now it's like, to be close to me is to be in a pod with me, or to be in your own pod. And like, that's maybe not mine. That's fine. Actually, I think it's really important. My experience is we should keep pods small. I wouldn't have more than 4 people. But yours should be with your closest people. And sometimes when we do this work, folks are like, but I don't trust anybody that much. And I'm like, okay, well, that's your step 1. What happened to your trust with your closest people rebuild that. I think it's Adrienne Marie Brown who says that our relationships are our biggest resource. That's been true for me. That's what brought me home from prison, and that's what brought all my friends home from prison. Secondly, as an artist, now that we're like, assuming we're now practicing it, now that we're like spreading it, it's going to be speaking the language at that deepest level of culture, that level one of your community. Like, I will probably make art that has something to do with like incarceration or the shit that I've went through. I'm working on a show right now about like jerk culture, like the jerking dance, because that was the shit that I grew up in LA in the early 2000s. So I'm going to spread it through what makes sense to me. Like, we're working with a young artist out of St. Louis who makes pop punk and metal music. And it's like, we're at step one with her. We're just trying to practice this with her and then see how it then grows into what she's going to spread with her community. I don't know what it's like to be a Gen Z Black woman who makes metal music. That's not my experience. So like, y'all are going to find out what it looks like and what you can spread once you practice it and you're in conversation with your direct community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Deeper into that, someone asked, and you talked a little bit about this, about keeping it small for people. Do you have anything else to say around the structure? You did show some slides that kind of show your circular, how you all kind of organize that. But folks did have some questions around how do you structure circular accountability practice? Like, what does that look like tangibly?
Yeah. Well, one, I encourage people to look up Soil, SOIL, Mia Mingus's organization that has a bunch of, you could look up Soil Mia Mingus or like Soil Accountability Pods or something like that. Has a bunch of resources on how to structure pods, and they give like trainings and all types of stuff. And we're actually going to link with them maybe later today or next week or something to get even more resources. But I'll share from my experience. We start with naming what our quote unquote top 5 is, which is our like most important relationships and like community goals. And then we do a round where we talk about what's going on with our relationships, like, because that top 5 is what we're now holding you accountable to. And then we do a round where we talk about our relationships, our finances, and our safety with the small group of people. And it is in that we can now help each other navigate those 3 areas in our lives in a way that best serves our top 5 relationships and goals. And we do that. I mean, there was a time when it was very structured and we were doing it every 3 weeks. There's been times where it's been less structured. I have different pods for different things. I have a pod around supporting, like, I'm building a pod around supporting one of my romantic relationships because we're dealing with shit that people deal with in romantic relationships, period. Like, it's not a personal thing to battle over and do the domination deservance thing with. I have my primary pod, which includes other formerly incarcerated men because we have similar shit to work through. A lot of the shit we talk about is patriarchy. And like, before I make a move dating a new person or before I check in with them, you know? I know my shapes a little bit. I know that I have ADHD. I know that I can be like, ooh, shiny new thing. Let me dive into this. And like, so I check in with people like, yeah, before I make moves that are maybe risky as a formerly incarcerated person with 2 strikes. Like, I went to another country by myself for the first time this year. I checked in with my pod. Like, what do we think about this? Like, you know? So it's also just like, it comes up like that too. Within the sometimes our job is a pod in terms of what we're doing, holding each other accountable to be in our values at the job. You know, question culture is kind of like its own pod. In Abolition Dream Lab, I'm in a pod of sorts with other Black abolitionist leaders that helped hold me to account to my own anti-capitalist values. I bought property in LA. Like, how do I now steward this property in a way that doesn't make me a freaking landlord? You know, like, yeah.
Yeah, I so appreciate how you brought it to the level of like, art is the portal. It's not everything. And it really is about how we're meeting our needs and how much you kind of brought it back to the first part in this series around economics, around cooperation. So I just love kind of how we circled out in this whole series. You know, all these portals have everything to do with each other, right? Because then it is also connected to climate also, right? And just extraction culture and all of this. So thank you for that. You went so deep into the history, like the Roman Empire, slave trade, and it can be really daunting sometimes when you think about, how do we create a culture that is rooted in these practices? And you laid out also some personal practices, but at Art.coop, we're kind of in this nebulous area of working with institutions also. And I'm curious what your take is on like what sorts of system level efforts are you seeing in the United States around abolition? Like I believe you shared with me there was some funder organizing that was happening. So, I'm thinking around, what gains have been made on the policy front, which I know you touched a little bit on that. Have there been any gains at the level of philanthropy? Or are there people that are investing in real ways in this work, and also in the realm of nonprofit arts institutions? What are you seeing out there? I know that's kind of a big question, but I feel like today we focus on the personal, which is everything. I agree with you. And I'm curious what you're seeing at the level of systems, of policy, of these larger institutions around abolition and culture.
Thank you. I've been home for 6 years now. I was an artist first, but then I started policy organizing when I was a kid, and I was doing policy organizing in prison as well. And from the time that I started policy organizing and being part of the statewide movement here in California to abolish incarceration in California, to now, it's been about 10 years. And we made huge gains. Like, we've transformed a lot of policy in California. We've made it the norm that incarcerated people are organizing in California. When I first started organizing in California prisons and talking to people about, your family can write bills, your family can like hit up their legislators and tell them to like push for one thing or another, or vote against something that's going to harm you in prison or whatever. People didn't even know what I was talking about. So we've made huge gains in terms of organizing. Initiate Justice, the organization that I started organizing with and helped start back then, now has like almost 50,000 members in California prisons, about half of all incarcerated people. And we have organizations like it all over the state, all over the country. And what we're seeing is there's a huge backlash coming back now the other way. In California, we have Prop 36, which will be on the November ballot, which would essentially erase all of the work that we did to get rid of mass incarceration in California and put us back in like the dark ages of extremely high sentences. We're still in those ages, but would just take us back 10 years. Like, we hit a max, we had 160,000 people in prison in the early 2000s. Right now it's down to 99,000. There's things on the ballot to erase all of our work, and it's actually very emotional. I got homies in prison who are getting notices under their doors that are saying, oh, you thought you were going to see the board in 2028? Well, you're not going to see the board until 2044. So that, and I bring that up to say, like, that's what we're seeing policy wise. And I've been home long enough to see these pendulums shifting. And that's why I actually really focus on the cultural side of it, because I actually don't want to commit to a world where we're trying to fight and beat the quote unquote opposition. Those humans, those Republicans, those Democrats who vote for these things and vote that destroy our communities, they have the same needs as us. Right now, they currently understand their needs as they can't be safe unless our people are in prison. So I'm now in the conversation of, and it's important that people are still doing that work to mitigate that harm and to get as many people out as quickly as possible. I'm now in the conversation of how do I live in a way that spreads and make art that spreads this accountability pod practice, because if those legislators were in that pod practice, they wouldn't be doing our people like that. They wouldn't be using their power like that. Actually, that whole power structure, top-down power structure, colonial power structure they're a part of, they wouldn't even believe it anymore. They would opt out, right? There's someone at Benjamin Netanyahu's dinner table that's not down with the genocide. Like, they're going to be, if I'm in a pod eventually and spreading that, eventually they will be in a pod, and eventually they're going to be like, Grandpa, that shit is not cool. And he's going to listen to them in a way that he's not listening to 40,000 of us standing outside yelling at an APAC thing, right? So again, it's not to put down protesting or policy organizing or any of these life-saving important measures, as much as an artist speaking to artists, We have the ability for our art to be portals, and we have the ability to be cultural organizers and to practice something that spreads, so that this pendulum swinging of like, you know, we had the civil rights movement, we won a bunch of stuff, and then we had the white backlash and mass incarceration, and then we won a bunch of stuff, and now we have MAGA, and then we won, like, to get out of that.
Wow, I had no idea about your policy work. That's really powerful. Someone asked in the chat, and you don't, if you don't feel comfortable answering, I understand. But they're asking you to distinguish between state abolition and prison abolition, and they see that as connected. And if you had thoughts about that, and that there are some who oppose prison abolition, but not necessarily the state, and vice versa. And maybe if the chatter wants to say more and has their own opinion about it that we can learn from, awesome. But I wanted to see if you had thoughts on that.
I remember I was having dinner in Washington, D.C. one time, and the server, we started talking about abolition, and they actually studied under Miriam Kaba, and they were like, so you're an abolitionist? I was like, yeah. And they're like, so you're a anarchist too? And I was like, no. And they were like, how can you be an abolitionist without being an anarchist? And I was like, what? Like, in my policy organizer brain, that didn't make sense to me. I'm like, the legislature is how we are abolishing prisons. And it took me years to understand what they were saying. And now I would say there's really no way to be an abolitionist, to believe in abolishing prisons and not abolishing the state, because the state is built upon the idea that all of our needs are at odds. Like, what is a country? It is an imaginary thing. What is a state is an imaginary thing. Like, there is nothing geographical that happens on the border between Mexico and the United States. There's nothing spiritual there. It is only the idea that people north of this border have one set of interests and people south of this border have another set of interests. And that's not true. We all have the same three needs. So as we align our needs with each other, we will get rid of the need for states. We will probably actually become a confederation of pods of people whose needs slightly differ because we're in different conditions, but we all understand that we all need each other to meet all of our needs and integrity. So I'm not interested. I'm actually really not interested in supporting people to be like abolishing prisons without abolishing the state. But that's not also where I start. I don't start by talking about what we're getting rid of. I start by talking about what we're building, which is a culture of aligning our needs with the needs of our community and the needs of the earth. And eventually it will make prisons and the state irrelevant.
Powerful. Thank you, Richie. Someone wants to know, and I think this is related to our series, how we're trying to talk in the realms of economics and the realms of climate. They want to know, can abolitionist art also be used in the fights against fossil fuels, industrialization, loss of nature? Where have you seen great examples where those kind of silos have kind of worked together?
Of course, because abolitionist art is anything that is a portal into, back to ourselves, back onto relying on ourselves instead of the state, a portal into circular accountability versus deservance punishment culture. And that that also serves the environment and the land. We are the land, like that is what we eat, that is what we drink, that is what we breathe, and it eats, drinks, and breathes us back. Like, we don't exist separately from one another. So there are films that, or not just films, I've been going to hella film festivals, so right now my art is largely centered around film, but there are pieces of art that really might center on incarceration, like Songs from the Hole, and there are pieces of art that really center on land, like, damn, what's that film about that telescope they were trying to build in Hawaii? But either way, we're like all trying to get at the same thing. Like, we are the land. We need each other and we need the land, and any system that separates us from each other and the land gotta go. And the only way to do that is to practice togetherness and cooperation with each other in the land.
Big facts there. Can you speak to like cultures of abolition on the inside? What kinds of organizations, or are there networks of incarcerated artists that or how do they practice this, or what did you see? And also in your own storytelling, you know, what are examples that we can learn from? Because I think sometimes when I'm doing my own research, I'm shocked of like I didn't know that there were organizations of like incarcerated artists that are like displaying their work and how we can support that. And so I was wondering if you had like strong passions and examples around that.
Yeah, I mean, the incarcerated people, I think similarly to queer people, similarly to um, disabled people or people who live in the global south, live much more indigenously, meaning like living in this kind of circular way where we rely on each other than a lot of us do here on the outside, or a lot of us do who have gender privilege or body privilege within the system of disableism or whatever, because that privilege gives us access to the system. So we don't rely on each other as much. When we have less access to the system, we rely on each other more. So I don't even think I'm well equipped to provide examples. There's so many examples. I can speak about the examples from my life, like the way that we used to share our art with one another in prison and in California prisons and jails, where you beat on the table and you rap and you come out and everybody shows each other a song. And that's the type of shit that keeps us alive. We're doing it at the level, that bottom level of culture of like, we have a shared practice. We all fuck with rap and hip hop music. Like, we're doing that so to keep our bodies and souls alive while they try to destroy us and profit off of us. There are orgs like Initiate Justice has an arts arm where they showcase the visual art of incarcerated people here in California. There's organizations like For Everyone Collective, which is the fashion collective partner of Question Culture that I work at, where we do like creative direction work. We help people develop their logos and visual worlds, and we hire incarcerated artists to do the art that we graphic design with. And even like on our brand stuff, we hire incarcerated people to do the art that we graphic design with. Like, there's cool models of how, you know, incarcerated artists are working and getting paid. San Quentin has a film festival coming up on October 11th that we're showing songs from the whole at. That'll be all formerly and currently incarcerated filmmakers. What I feel most pulled to like share with this group of people, assuming everybody's on the outside, is to one, the way that we can be like them is to practice circular accountability, because ain't nobody in prison going to the police for shit. So we have to practice circular accountability. The way we can, and the ways that we can support them is to like seek out, you know, not just the orgs I mentioned, which are all unique to California, because I'm speaking from my own experience. Even though with For Everyone, we work with incarcerated artists all over the country, but and to support those organizations and to pay incarcerated people for their art the same way you would pay for people for their art on the outside.
Yeah, we have 9 minutes here, and I had a question around 2020 and this moment where defund was so prominent in the culture and abolition was on many people's minds. It was almost like a culture war. It was a culture war moment, and you mentioned a little bit around this backlash in some of your work. You know, what are you seeing right now that's giving you hope given that backlash? I mean, I guess, you know, you've talked a lot about the personal pods and it all coming back to that. But are you seeing things in the level of popular culture of people with huge platforms that can bring us back to this conversation? Or, you know, kind of I wonder, as a communications professional, as a cultural organizer, how do we bring that conversation back into prominence? And what are examples of people in culture that are doing that, right? Especially in this moment where, like, for example, Beyonce's Freedom, right, being used for the Kamala campaign, right? Or what we saw yesterday with the roll call, you know, how prominent the DJ was. And everybody's like, wow, this DJ had actually made this interest, you know, they know how important arts and culture is, right, in pushing their aims. And what are some of our, you know, kind of tools and figures and people that we can like invest in who are pushing abolition culture?
I would say, well, I'm going to bring it back to the pods again, honestly, because in 2020, we were winning for a second. And the reason why we lost was because our practice was not as developed as our rhetoric. So culturally, we were winning in that people knew what abolition was, people knew what defunding was, there was thousands, millions of people in the streets. But because we were not practicing it, we were not practicing circular accountability, we were ultimately still relying on their forms of accountability. The ruptures were deep. All those organizations fell apart. All my homies were leaders of those organizations. Like every single organizations that got a bunch of money didn't know how to deal with it. It became conflict. They fell apart. Like people got arrested. People got doxxed. People got, motherfuckers climbing in their backyards trying to kill them. Like it's very serious. And we're still dealing with the fallout of 2020. And a lot of people don't trust organizing anymore. Because they're like, oh, it's all fake. They're just trying to get rich or whatever. And yeah, if we're not practicing something besides domination-based culture, we're just going to recreate it. And that is what I'm seeing today. Here we are in 2024. It's weird. This 2020 is my first time ever voting for president in my life because I've been incarcerated or on some form of paperwork or was just too young to vote before that. But here we are 2024, and it's basically the same two agendas on the ticket because we're in the same system, because we're not practicing anything new. And my experience is a lot of people aren't practicing anything new, even the folks who like want to be the abolitionist voices of today. And I appreciate those folks, and I'm in community with a lot of those folks. And that, that sharing is helpful. It is important. We saw the difference between when the genocide in Gaza started versus what the protests were looking like once we had huge voices like Kehlani and India Moore, and like when we saw the difference that made. This is the first time we've ever had mainstream artists speak up for Palestine in such a united way that I'm aware of. And my 32 years of life. I remember when you can even say the words fucking Palestine, or the Zionists just had so much power, and they still do. Look, they're trying to get This Is Bizan from Gaza and I'm Still Alive get its Emmy pulled, right? Its Emmy nomination pulled. But so that stuff is important, and the conversation that I actually have been organizing a lot of these influencers and people with big voices as a part of our work at the Dream Lab to begin practice pods. And we're organizing funders to begin in practice pods. And we're organizing the leaders of organizations to begin in practice pods, because we cannot spread a culture we do not practice. That's why when Kamala running for president was so good at dividing our movement, because we were playing with the old playbook of identity politics, right versus wrong, debating. Debating is a colonial act. It's a right-wrong thing. So now we're all online debating because we're not trained on how to listen. Like all those skills I ran through, that's not the norm. Until that's the norm, we will be in this same loop. They will keep gaining power. They will keep stratifying the difference between rich and poor. There will be more genocide. There will be more incarceration. There will be more houselessness. And we're going to be like, you can have the dopest aesthetics in the world, the loudest microphones in the world. We have access to followers post-2020. We have access to ears and attention that we never had before. But if we're not practicing something different, we just going to be in the same loop.
I'm so glad to hear that you're organizing these influencers around pods, and I think everyone in the chat is like, we're ready for this future of confederated pod life that you mentioned. I want to see if you have any last words. And there was someone in the chat who wanted to know how they could reach out for possible collaboration or mutual support in this abolitionist pod life. So as you're closing out with final words, you can also share how folks can connect with you as well.
Cool. I think I do want to share just one more thing. What gives me hope is that there are voices, there is a growing community of people calling for this practice-centered embodiment life and this pod life. Like, I did not make this up. I'm standing on the shoulders of Adrienne Marie Brown, Mia Mingus. Like, there's people who've been doing this and who have, like, the first Generation 5 report came out in 2007, when I was in high school. Like, I was 14 years old, 15 years old. And so there is a growing, like, we're not weirdos in the same way we were. We're not isolated in the same way we were. There are more and more people centering practice, and we have platforms like this to be able to center practice, artists coming together and talking about practice. So that's what gives me hope. Like, we will win. This is a generational integrating that we're doing. This is a generational healing that we're doing. I don't even want to call it a fight or a struggle. Like, I'm done fighting and struggling. Like, I'm healing, I'm integrating. And that feels hard sometimes. It's a challenge. It's not all fucking sprinkles and rainbows, but it is, the intention is to heal and integrate with all living and natural things. And we're doing it. And that's what gives me hope. The fact that I think 50 influencers came to those calls all together with a reach of 100 million followers. It's like, and we're talking about pods, is huge, you know? I'm excited for, and the fact that funders are down, the fact that artists are down. When the artists do it, like, we are the ones at the beginning of the bell curve. Like, we're the cool motherfuckers. Like, if we're doing it, we will spread this practice. And hopefully, you know, our children's generation, our grandchildren's generation will live in a world where it's the norm and genocide, incarceration, rape culture isn't. So that's what gives me hope. And for folks who want to talk more, collab, share, whatever, all my socials are just at Richie Reseda. I don't know if you see my name, but it's just at Richie Reseda. Our collective Instagram is at question.culture. And yeah, DM me, my co-director and managers emails in my bio. So email her, because she actually checks her emails. If you email me, Nati will tell you. It might work, it might not.
No, Richie, I just want to thank you so much for being a part of this series and closing us out in such a beautiful kind of circular closing way. And that's the North Star for us, right? It's like, we got to get, as culture workers, as artists, engaged and connected to these movements, because we're going to usher in this shit, right? We have to practice it. So I learned a lot today. I hope you all in the chat, out there in the world, watching this later on, share this with others in your community, share this with culture workers who are frustrated, know that these systems are not what we need and are looking for ways to plug in. That's what this series is about. So please share this in your world. And folks asked about the call to art. Yes, I'm going to put a link in the chat here. It's part of the Through the Portal 2024.org conference, which is happening in Chicago next month. The deadline for the call to art is August 26th. That's this Monday. I put a link in the chat. Everyone from Angela Davis to Rashida Tlaib to Jamila Wood will be in person in Chicago next month. And so if you have work that you want to share with us and share with that gathering that has to do with these portals, right, of economic justice, of climate, of abolition, please submit a work. And if you're in Chicago and you want to drop off, you know, a tangible piece of artwork, we have that option as well. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, University of Illinois, Chicago, Portal Project, Artists for Radical Imagination, which is a dope network of, I believe, hundreds of visual artists that are thinking about how do we grow this movement for radical imagination around this care and justice and all these different kind of concepts we're talking about. And art.coop, where we're working to resource experiments like Richie's and others around the country that are building these economies at the root, right? Not just Black and brown faces in high places in arts and culture, but how are we building new institutions that are doing what Richie talked to us about, right? Of just how they're not trying to nickel and dime artists, for example. They're trying to share prosperity and remunerate artists and culture workers. So that's what we're about. Join us next month at the conference, and we'll see you soon. Peace out, everybody.